The massive space station called Unity Academy floated silently in the darkness between three star systems. Its metal walls stretched for miles in every direction, housing thousands of students from across the galaxy. Inside one of the Academy's many classrooms, morning light from a distant sun filtered through the transparent aluminum windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Jake Martinez sat in the back row of advanced tactical strategy class, trying not to feel completely out of place among his alien classmates. At 19 years old, he was the only human in a room filled with beings that seemed designed for greatness. His brown hair and average build made him look plain next to creatures that had evolved on dozens of different worlds under alien suns. Professor Cathara stood at the front of the classroom, her crystalline body reflecting the light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Velnari were known throughout the galaxy as master teachers and strategists, and Cathara was considered one of their best. Her voice rang like wind chimes when she spoke, each word clear and precise. Today we will examine a problem that has challenged military minds for decades, she announced to the class. You will work in teams based on your species' natural abilities. Jake looked around the room at his fellow students. Near the front sat three Zephyrians, their blue-tinted skin almost glowing with intelligence. Everyone knew the Zephyrians could solve mathematical problems in their heads that would take computers hours to process. Their large black eyes never blinked as they absorbed information at incredible speeds. Behind them, 5 members of the collective sat perfectly still, their gray faces blank and emotionless. Jake had learned that they shared one mind between all of them, thinking as a single unit that could process multiple ideas at once. When one spoke, they all knew exactly what to say. When one learned something new, they all learned it instantly. The Corvin students occupied the middle rows, their muscular bodies built for war and their minds naturally suited for battle tactics. Even sitting still, they looked dangerous. Their red skin bore the ritual scars that marked them as members of the warrior caste, and their yellow eyes constantly scanned the room for threats that did not exist. Other species filled the remaining seats. The spider-like arachne with their 8 arms perfect for multitasking, the gaseous nebular who could think in dimensions that solid beings could not understand, the plant-based Verdani who processed information through their root networks and never made decisions quickly or without careful consideration. Each species had evolved specific talents that made them valuable to the galactic community. Each had something special that set them apart from the others. Jake was beginning to wonder what humans brought to this collection of superior beings. The scenario I'm about to present has been tested on the finest military academies across 12 worlds. Professor Cathara continued. No solution has ever been found that saves more than 70% of the lives at stake. She touched a control on her desk, and the room's walls disappeared, replaced by a 3-dimensional projection of space. A massive colony ship drifted slowly toward a planet covered in violent storms. The ship looked damaged, with pieces of metal floating away from its hull and emergency lights flashing along its sides. The colony ship Meridian carries 50,000 civilians, Cathara explained. Its engines are failing and it cannot escape the gravity well of the planet below. The planet itself is experiencing electromagnetic storms that interfere with most rescue technology. 3 hostile fleets are approaching the area and will arrive in 48 hours. The projection zoomed in to show the details. The colony ship was huge but clearly dying, its power systems flickering as it fought against the planet's gravitational pull. The planet below churned with massive storms that sent electrical discharges into space like reaching fingers. In the distance, red dots marked the positions of enemy ships moving closer with each passing moment. Previous attempts to solve this crisis have focused on evacuation protocols, the professor said. The mathematics are brutal. Standard evacuation ships can carry at most 15,000 people per trip. The approaching enemy fleets will not allow multiple rescue attempts. The electromagnetic storms make teleportation technology unreliable at best. Jake studied the scenario carefully while his classmates began their analysis. The Zephyrians had already started calculating evacuation routes and resource requirements, their minds processing hundreds of variables simultaneously. The collective members sat in perfect silence, sharing thoughts and ideas through their mental link at the speed of thought. The Corvin students were drawing up battle plans to fight off the hostile fleets, their warrior instincts focused on defeating the enemy rather than running from them. The other species each approached the problem through the lens of their natural abilities, looking for solutions that played to their evolutionary strengths. Professor Cathera assigned the teams and gave them 2 hours to develop their strategies. Jake found himself working alone, as there were no other humans in the class to team with. This was not unusual for him at Unity Academy. Humans were still new to the galactic community, having only made contact with alien civilizations 15 years earlier. Most species still saw them as primitive newcomers with little to contribute. As the teams worked, Jake listened to the discussions happening around him. The Zephyrians were running probability calculations and determining optimal passenger loads for theoretical rescue ships. The collective was simulating thousands of evacuation scenarios in their shared consciousness, testing each possibility for flaws and inefficiencies. The Corvin were planning military strikes against the approaching fleets, calculating weapons effectiveness and fleet positioning. The Arachni were designing complex coordination protocols that would allow multiple rescue operations to occur simultaneously. Each group approached the problem with impressive competence and deep expertise. Jake sat quietly and thought about the 50,000 people trapped on the dying ship. He imagined families huddled together in emergency shelters, children asking their parents when help would come, elderly people who might not survive the stress of evacuation, even if rescue ships arrived. He thought about the fear they must be feeling and the hope they were clinging to as their ship slowly fell toward the storm-covered planet below, while his classmates focused on ships and weapons and mathematical probabilities. Jake found himself thinking about the people. He wondered what they were doing right now, how they were spending what might be their final hours, whether they had given up hope or were still fighting to survive. The 2 hours passed quickly, and Professor Cathera called for presentations. Each team would have 15 minutes to explain their solution and demonstrate its effectiveness using the Academy's advanced simulation systems. Jake realized that soon he would have to stand in front of these brilliant alien minds and offer his own answer to an impossible problem that had stumped the galaxy's best strategists for decades. The Zephyrian team presented first, their leader speaking in the rapid, precise manner typical of their species. They had calculated 17 different evacuation scenarios, each one optimized for maximum efficiency and minimal resource waste. Their solution involved a complex dance of rescue ships working in perfect coordination, with evacuation priorities assigned based on age, health status, and social value to the colony. Our mathematical analysis indicates a survival rate of 68.7%, the lead Zephyrian announced with satisfaction. This represents optimal resource allocation given the time and technological constraints of the scenario. The projection showed their plan in action. Rescue ships swooped in through carefully calculated gaps in the electromagnetic interference, loading passengers with mechanical precision and departing before the hostile fleets could intercept them. It was elegant and efficient, but Jake noticed that their plan simply accepted the loss of over 15,000 lives as an unavoidable mathematical reality. The collective presented next, their 5 members speaking in perfect unison as if they were components of a single machine. Their shared consciousness had allowed them to simulate thousands of scenarios simultaneously, testing variables and combinations that individual minds could never process. We have identified the statistically optimal approach through parallel processing of all possible outcomes, they said together, their voices creating an eerie harmony. Survival probability increases to 71.3% through selective evacuation, protocols, and strategic resource management. Their solution was more sophisticated than the Zephyrian approach, involving multiple rescue operations timed to avoid both the electromagnetic storms and the approaching enemy fleets. They had identified which passengers should be saved first, based on genetic diversity, skill sets, and reproductive potential. Like the Zephyrians, they accepted significant casualties as an inevitable part of the equation. The Corvin team took a completely different approach. Their presentation focused on military action rather than evacuation, with detailed battle plans for engaging the hostile fleets before they could threaten the colony ship. Their leader, a scarred warrior named Vextar, spoke with the confidence of someone born for combat. "We do not run from enemies," he declared, his yellow eyes blazing with fierce pride. "We destroy the threat and save everyone. Our analysis shows that a preemptive strike against the hostile fleets has a 43% chance of complete success. There, simulation showed Corvan warships launching surprise attacks against the approaching enemies, using superior tactics and warrior courage to overcome numerical disadvantages. If successful, the plan would eliminate the time pressure and allow for complete evacuation. If unsuccessful, everyone would die. It was a typically Corvan solution, bold and uncompromising. The other teams presented variations on similar themes. The Arachne proposed a complex web of simultaneous rescue operations coordinated through their natural multitasking abilities. The Nebulars suggested phasing the evacuation ships through dimensional space to avoid the electromagnetic interference. The Verdani recommended a slow, careful approach that prioritized the preservation of the colony's genetic material and cultural knowledge over individual lives. Each solution demonstrated the presenting species' natural strengths and evolutionary advantages. Each one saved some lives while accepting the loss of others. Each one approached the problem through the lens of what that species did best, whether it was mathematics, warfare, coordination, or dimensional manipulation. Professor Cathara nodded approvingly after each presentation. These represent excellent applications of your species' natural capabilities, she told the class. The solutions range from 68 to 71% survival rates, which matches or exceeds the best results achieved by military strategists across the galaxy. Jake had been listening carefully to every presentation, taking notes and thinking about the approaches his classmates had chosen. He noticed that while each solution was technically impressive and played to the presenting species' strengths, they all shared certain assumptions about what was possible and what was not. When his turn came, Jake stood slowly and walked to the front of the classroom. He could feel the attention of his alien classmates focusing on him, though not with the same intensity they had shown for the other presentations. Most of them expected very little from the lone human student. Humans were known to be average at almost everything, with no particular evolutionary advantages that would help solve complex strategic problems. I've been thinking about this scenario differently than everyone else, Jake began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. All of your solutions are really good, and they show how smart and capable your species are. But I think we're all missing something important. He gestured toward the projection of the dying colony ship. Everyone has been focused on getting people off that ship before it crashes or gets destroyed. We've been thinking about evacuation and rescue and fighting off the enemy fleets. But what if we're approaching this all wrong? A few of his classmates exchanged glances. The collective members tilted their heads in unison, their shared curiosity piqued by Jake's unusual opening. Professor Cathara remained silent, waiting to see where the human student would take his analysis. The problem with evacuation is that we can't save everyone, right? The ships are too small, the time is too short, and the interference makes everything complicated. The problem with fighting is that we might lose and then everyone dies. So we're stuck choosing between saving some people for sure or maybe saving everyone but probably saving no one. Jake paused and looked around the room. But what if we don't try to rescue them at all? The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several students made sounds of confusion or dismay in their native languages. The Corvan warrior Vextar growled low in his throat, apparently interpreting Jake's words as cowardice. Even Professor Cathara's crystalline features shifted in what might have been disappointment. I don't mean abandon them, Jake said quickly, raising his hands to calm the room. I mean, what if instead of trying to get them off the ship, we give them what they need to save themselves? The confusion in the room only deepened. The lead Zephyrian spoke up, his mathematical mind struggling with Jake's illogical approach. The colony ship is failing and will crash into the planet within 36 hours. The planet's surface is hostile and the electromagnetic storms make survival impossible. Your suggestion lacks mathematical foundation. Jake nodded. You're right that the ship is going to crash. And you're right that the planet looks hostile. But what if those aren't problems to solve? What if they're advantages to use? He moved to the control panel and began manipulating the projection, zooming in on the storm-covered planet below the failing colony ship. Everyone sees those electromagnetic storms as interference that makes rescue harder. But what if they're actually protection? What if we help the colonists land on the planet instead of trying to get them off the ship? The room erupted in objections. The collective spoke in their eerie unison. The mathematical probability of 50,000 civilians surviving on a hostile planet is negligible. They lack the training, equipment, and biological adaptations necessary for planetary colonization under emergency conditions. The Arachne representative clicked her mandibles, and what Jake had learned was their equivalent of laughter. Even if they could somehow survive the initial landing, which is itself impossible, they would have no way to defend themselves against the hostile fleets when they arrive. Jake listened to all the objections, nodding thoughtfully as each species explained why his idea could not work. Their reasoning was logical and based on solid analysis of the scenario's parameters. By every measure of conventional strategic thinking, his suggestion was absurd, but Jake was not thinking conventionally. He was thinking like a human, which meant he was thinking about something that none of his alien classmates had considered. He was thinking about what desperate people could accomplish when they had no choice but to try the impossible. Jake stood calmly in front of the classroom while his alien classmates continued to voice their objections to his seemingly impossible plan. He had expected this reaction, because he understood that every species in the room was thinking about the problem through the lens of their own evolutionary strengths and limitations. What they could not understand was that humans approached impossible situations differently than anyone else in the galaxy. "Let me explain how this could actually work," Jake said, his voice cutting through the chatter of alien languages. "First, you're all right that the colonists can't survive a normal crash landing on that planet. But what if it's not a normal crash?" He manipulated the projection to show a detailed view of the colony ship's structure. This ship wasn't designed for atmospheric entry, but it's huge and it has massive structural components that could be repurposed. Instead of trying to keep it in space where it's vulnerable, we help them bring it down in a controlled crash that spreads the debris across a wide area. The Zephyrian mathematician immediately began calculating atmospheric entry vectors and structural stress factors. The energy requirements for controlled atmospheric entry would exceed the ship's remaining power reserves by a factor of 7. "Your proposal violates basic physics," Jake shook his head. "Not if we use the planet's electromagnetic field to help slow the descent. Those storms that everyone sees as obstacles could actually help break the ship's fall if we time the entry correctly. The colonists don't need to land softly, they just need to land in pieces they can use." He zoomed the projection in further, showing how the ship's various sections could be separated during descent. The reactor section lands here, providing power for temporary shelters. The manufacturing bays land over there, giving them tools and equipment. The hydroponic sections become the foundation for food production. Instead of trying to keep the ship together, we turn it into the foundation for a ground-based colony. Professor Kethera leaned forward, her crystalline features reflecting her growing interest despite her initial skepticism. Even assuming the colonists could survive such a landing and establish basic shelter, the hostile fleets would simply attack them on the planet's surface. "You have not addressed the primary threat." Jake smiled, and for the first time since he had started his presentation, he looked completely confident. "Actually, I have. The electromagnetic storms that interfere with rescue ships will also interfere with orbital bombardment and ground assault operations. The hostile fleets won't be able to target the colonists effectively through all that interference." The Corvan warrior Vextar growled his disagreement. "Electromagnetic storms are temporary phenomena. When they clear, the colonists will be defenseless against military attack. Your plan merely delays their deaths." "That's where you're wrong," Jake replied. "Because by the time the storms clear, the colonists won't be helpless refugees anymore. They'll be an established colony with fortifications, weapons, and the home field advantage." He changed the projection to show a timeline extending beyond the immediate crisis. "Look at what 50,000 people can accomplish in a few months when they're fighting for their lives. They'll have turned the ship's debris into a fortress. They'll have figured out how to use the planet's natural resources. They'll have adapted to the environment in ways that trained soldiers from other worlds never could." The Arachne representative clicked her mandibles again, but this time the sound seemed less like laughter and more like nervous uncertainty. "You are making assumptions about civilian capabilities that have no basis in tactical analysis. Untrained colonists cannot be expected to perform like military engineers or combat specialists." Jake turned to face her directly. "That's exactly my point. You're all thinking about this like a military problem that needs a military solution. But what if it's not a military problem at all? What if it's a survival problem and humans are really good at survival?" He gestured toward the projection of the storm-covered planet. "Every species in this room has evolved to be excellent at something specific. Zephyrians are mathematical geniuses. The collective can process information faster than anyone. Corvan are natural warriors. But humans evolved to be good at something different. We evolved to be good at not giving up when everything looks hopeless. The room fell silent as Jake's words sank in. He had just claimed that humanity's greatest strength was something that none of the other species possessed or even understood. It was a bold statement that challenged everything they thought they knew about evolutionary advantages and species capabilities. Throughout human history, our people have survived things that should have killed them, Jake continued. We've lived through ice ages and droughts and plagues and wars. We've crossed oceans in tiny boats and climbed mountains that scraped the sky. We've figured out how to live in deserts and jungles and frozen wastelands. And we did all of this without any special evolutionary advantages. The nebular representative, whose gaseous form had been silently observing from the corner, spoke in their whispering voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. What you describe sounds like adaptation through desperation rather than intelligence. Such behavior would be considered irrational by most species. Jake nodded. Exactly. It is irrational, and that's what makes it work. When faced with impossible odds, most species calculate the probability of success and give up if the numbers are too low. Humans calculate the probability of success and then try anyway, because the alternative is definitely dying, and trying gives us a chance to live. He turned back to the projection and began showing specific details of his plan. The colonists won't just survive that landing, they'll use it as an opportunity. They'll turn the reactor into a power source for their new settlement. They'll convert the manufacturing equipment to produce weapons and tools suited for their environment. They'll use the hydroponic systems to grow food that works on this particular planet. Professor Cathara studied the projection carefully, her analytical mind working through the implications of Jake's unconventional approach. Your plan assumes that civilians will be able to perform complex engineering tasks under extreme stress while adapting to an alien environment. The mathematical probability of success appears to be very low. The mathematical probability is low, Jake agreed. But math doesn't account for human stubbornness. It doesn't factor in our ability to find solutions that shouldn't work, but do. It doesn't consider that when you give humans a choice between certain death and uncertain survival, they'll choose uncertain survival every time and then figure out how to make it work. He paused and looked around the room at his alien classmates. All of your solutions focused on using your species' natural advantages to solve the problem in ways that make sense to you. The Zephyrians used mathematics, the Collective used parallel processing, the Corvin used military tactics, but humans don't have any natural advantages like that. Jake's voice grew stronger as he reached the core of his argument. What we have instead is the ability to look at an impossible situation and refuse to accept that it's impossible. We have the ability to take whatever we can find and turn it into whatever we need. Most importantly, we have the ability to keep trying new things until something works, even when logic says we should give up. The classroom remained silent as everyone absorbed what Jake had said. His plan was not just unconventional, it was based on assumptions about human nature that no other species shared or understood. He was claiming that desperation and stubbornness could overcome mathematical certainty and logical analysis. But as the students thought about what they knew of human history and human behavior, they began to realize that Jake might be describing something real. Something that set his species apart from everyone else in ways that could not be measured or quantified. Something that might actually work when nothing else could. Professor Cathara moved to her control console with deliberate precision, her crystalline fingers dancing across the interface as she prepared to run Jake's unconventional plan through the Academy's most advanced simulation systems. The classroom held its collective breath. Dozens of alien minds focused on the projection that would either validate or destroy the human student's radical approach to an impossible problem. I will input your parameters exactly as presented, she announced, her wind chime voice carrying a note of scientific curiosity that had not been present for the other presentations. The simulation will model civilian behavior, environmental factors, and technological adaptation over an extended timeline. Jake watched nervously as the professor fed his plan into the computer systems. Unlike his classmates' solutions, which had been based on proven mathematical models and established tactical doctrine, his approach relied on assumptions about human nature that had never been formally tested or quantified. He was asking the most sophisticated military simulation in the galaxy to predict what desperate people would do when faced with certain death. The projection flickered and began showing Jake's scenario in action. The colony ship Meridian appeared on screen, its hull breached and engines failing as it fell toward the storm-covered planet. But instead of trying to escape or await rescue, the colonists inside began implementing Jake's survival plan with desperate efficiency. Emergency teams worked frantically to separate the ship into sections, using controlled explosions and manual cutting tools to break apart their only shelter in space. It looked like madness to the alien observers who could not understand why anyone would destroy their protection voluntarily. But Jake had calculated that a controlled breakup in space was better than an uncontrolled crash on the planet's surface. The reactor section entered the planet's atmosphere first, its massive bulk creating a crater that would become the foundation for the colony's power grid. The manufacturing bays landed in a rough circle around the reactor site, their heavy equipment scattered but mostly intact. The hydroponics modules came down like metallic rain, spreading across several square kilometers of the planet's surface. What happened next surprised even Jake with its speed and effectiveness. The simulation showed colonists emerging from emergency pods and immediately beginning to salvage useful materials from the wreckage around them. Instead of panicking or waiting for instructions, they began working together with the kind of desperate cooperation that only emerged when survival was at stake. Within hours of the crash landing, the colonists had established basic shelter using pieces of the ship's hull and begun connecting the scattered equipment into a functional infrastructure. The reactor was brought online to provide power for essential systems. The manufacturing equipment was reconfigured to produce tools and weapons suited for their new environment. The hydroponic systems were modified to work with local soil and atmospheric conditions. The Zephyrian student who had criticized Jake's mathematical foundation stared at the projection in disbelief. The efficiency rates being displayed exceed all known parameters for civilian crisis response, he said, his voice filled with confusion. According to standard models, untrained personnel should require weeks to achieve this level of coordination. The collective members spoke in their eerie unison, their shared consciousness struggling to process what they were seeing. The simulation indicates decision-making processes that do not follow logical optimization protocols. The colonists are making choices based on incomplete information and emotional factors rather than calculated risk assessment. But Jake understood what his alien classmates could not. The colonists were not following logical protocols because logic would have told them their situation was hopeless. Instead, they were operating on pure human stubbornness, the refusal to give up that had carried his species through countless disasters throughout their history. The simulation continued, showing the colony's development over the following months. The electromagnetic storms that had made rescue impossible proved to be an unexpected advantage, providing natural camouflage and interference that made it difficult for the hostile fleets to locate or target the settlement. The colonists used this protection to fortify their position and adapt to their environment. What amazed the alien observers was how quickly the humans learned to exploit resources that other species would not have recognized as useful. They turned the planet's violent weather into a power source for their equipment. They modified native plants for food production. They used local minerals to create alloys that were stronger than their original ship components. Within 6 months, the simulation showed a thriving settlement of nearly 50,000 people who had not only survived their impossible situation, but had turned it into an opportunity for growth and expansion. The hostile fleets that had originally threatened them found themselves facing a well-defended colony with advanced technology and intimate knowledge of local conditions. Professor Kethara studied the simulation, results with growing amazement. The survival rate is 100%, she announced to the stunned classroom. Not only do all 50,000 colonists survive the initial crisis, but population projections show steady growth over the extended timeline. This exceeds any previous solution by a significant margin. The Corvan warrior Vextar leaned forward in his seat, his yellow eyes fixed on the projection. The military effectiveness displayed by civilian colonists contradicts all known tactical doctrine. How do untrained humans develop combat capabilities that rival professional soldiers? Jake had been waiting for this question. They don't become professional soldiers, he explained. They become something different. They become people fighting for their homes and families on ground they know better than any invader ever could. That's not the same as military training, but it can be just as effective. The projection showed several skirmishes between the colonial defenders and advanced scout forces from the hostile fleets. The humans did not fight like trained soldiers using established tactics and conventional weapons. Instead, they fought like people defending their only hope of survival, using improvised equipment and intimate knowledge of local conditions to overcome better-armed opponents. The Arachne representative had been silent throughout the simulation, her 8 eyes studying every detail of the human colony's development. Finally, she spoke with something that might have been admiration in her clicking voice. The adaptive efficiency demonstrated by your species challenges fundamental assumptions about intelligent behavior. You appear to thrive in conditions that would cause other species to abandon hope. Jake nodded. That's exactly right. Every species in this room has evolved specific advantages that help them survive in their native environments. But humans evolved on a planet where the environment kept changing in ways that made our previous advantages useless. We learned to survive by becoming good at adapting to whatever conditions we faced. Professor Cathera was running additional calculations, her crystalline mind processing the implications of what the simulation had revealed. If these results are accurate, human crisis response capabilities represent a unique resource for the galactic community. The ability to find successful solutions in scenarios with mathematically negligible success probabilities could be invaluable. The Ichor Nebular's gaseous form shimmered with what Jake had learned was their equivalent of deep thought. Your species appears to operate on principles that contradict optimal decision-making theory. Yet the outcomes suggest these principles may be more effective than logic-based approaches under certain conditions. Jake looked around the classroom at his alien classmates, seeing their expressions of confusion, amazement, and dawning respect. They were beginning to understand that humans brought something to the galactic community that no other species possessed. Not superior intelligence or advanced technology or specialized evolutionary advantages, but something far more rare and valuable. The thing about humans is that we're not naturally good at anything specific, Jake said quietly. We're not the strongest or the smartest or the fastest. We don't have built-in weapons or telepathic abilities or mathematical genius. What we have is the ability to look at an impossible situation and say, maybe it's not impossible after all. Let me try something different. The simulation continued running in the background, showing the human colony growing stronger and more prosperous with each passing year. It was a testament to what desperate people could accomplish when they refused to accept defeat and were willing to try solutions that logic said could never work. The simulation reached its conclusion, showing the human colony not just surviving but thriving 20 years after the initial crisis. The settlement had grown into a major trade hub that served multiple star systems. Its success built on the foundation of impossible choices made by desperate people who refused to give up. Jake felt a mixture of pride and exhaustion as he watched his alien classmates struggle to understand what they had just witnessed. Professor Cathara stood silently for several long moments, her crystalline features reflecting the light from the projection in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. When she finally spoke, her wind chime voice carried a gravity that made everyone in the classroom lean forward to listen more carefully. I must make a confession to this class, she announced, her words causing a ripple of surprise among the students. The scenario I presented today was not theoretical as I claimed. It was a real crisis that occurred 53 years ago in the Kepler 442 system. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Students from multiple species began speaking at once in their native languages, creating a cacophony of clicks, whistles, and harmonic tones that filled the classroom. Jake felt his heart skip a beat as the implications of the professor's revelation sank in. The colony ship was called the New Horizon, not the Meridian, Cathara continued, waiting for the noise to die down. It carried 47,000 civilians, not 50,000. But the essential details were accurate. The ship was failing, the planet was hostile. 3 enemy fleets were approaching, and conventional rescue was impossible. She manipulated the classroom projection to show historical records instead of simulation results. Images appeared of a real crash site on a real planet, with actual human colonists working desperately to turn wreckage into shelter. The scenes matched Jake's predictions with startling accuracy. The rescue fleet that responded to the crisis included ships from 7 different species, the professor explained. Military strategists from the Zephyrian Mathematical Corps, collective tactical analysts, Corvan battle commanders, and others. They spent 18 hours developing evacuation plans that could save at most 32,000 people. Jake stared at the historical images, recognizing the same desperate efficiency he had described in his solution. Real colonists working with improvised tools to build something impossible from the ruins of their only hope. Real people choosing uncertain survival over certain death and somehow making it work. The human rescue ships arrived during the final strategy session, Kethora continued. Captain Peter Chen of the Earth Defense Force reviewed the situation for exactly 17 minutes before rejecting all proposed evacuation plans. Instead, he ordered his ships to begin dropping supplies and equipment to help the colonists establish a ground-based settlement. The Zephyrian student who had challenged Jake's mathematics earlier spoke up, his voice filled with confusion and something that might have been awe. The historical records show that all 47,000 colonists survived the initial crisis. The mathematical probability of such an outcome should have been essentially zero. Professor Kethora nodded. The mathematical probability was zero, according to every analysis performed by every species except humans. Captain Chen's response to those calculations was, and I quote from the official records, "Math doesn't account for human stubbornness. Let's give them a chance to prove the numbers wrong." The classroom fell silent as students absorbed the reality that Jake had not just proposed a theoretical solution to an impossible problem. He had independently arrived at the same approach that real humans had used to save real lives in a real crisis that had occurred decades before he was born. The collective members spoke in their haunting unison, their shared consciousness clearly struggling with concepts that did not fit their logical framework. The success of such an approach suggests that human decision-making processes operate on principles that transcend conventional analysis. This challenges fundamental assumptions about optimal crisis response. Jake found his voice, though he was still reeling from the revelation. "You mean this really happened? Real people survived by doing exactly what I suggested." "Not exactly what you suggested," Professor Kethora corrected with what might have been amusement in her crystalline voice. "Your solution was actually more sophisticated than the historical approach. Captain Chen's plan was simpler and more desperate, but the underlying philosophy was identical. When faced with impossible odds, humans choose to try anyway." She brought up more historical records showing the development of what became known as Chen's colony over the following decades. The settlement had indeed grown into a major trade center, exactly as Jake's simulation had predicted. The colonists had not just survived their crash landing, they had turned it into the foundation for one of the most prosperous multi-species communities in that sector of the galaxy. The Corvan warrior Vextar had been studying the historical battle records, his yellow eyes burning with professional interest. The defensive actions taken by civilian colonists exceeded military effectiveness standards by significant margins. How do untrained humans achieve combat performance that rivals professional soldiers? "They don't," Jake replied, understanding now that his intuition about human nature had been validated by actual history. "They achieve something different. They fight like people defending their only hope of survival, which turns out to be more effective than fighting like professional soldiers following established doctrine." The Arachne representative clicked her mandibles. In a pattern Jake had learned indicated deep thought. The implications for galactic crisis response are significant. Human approaches to impossible scenarios could provide alternatives when conventional methods prove inadequate. Professor Kethora manipulated the projection to show recent galactic events where human involvement had led to unexpected successes in seemingly hopeless situations. Mining accidents where human rescue teams had saved people that other species had given up for dead. Natural disasters where human aid workers had found ways to provide relief in conditions that stopped other species cold. Military conflicts where human mediators had negotiated peace agreements that everyone else considered impossible. Over the past 15 years, since humans joined the galactic community, this pattern has repeated dozens of times, she explained. Situations that defeat conventional approaches somehow become manageable when humans get involved. Not because they have superior technology or abilities, but because they refuse to accept that problems cannot be solved. The nebular's gaseous form shimmered with what Jake now recognized as excitement rather than confusion. "Your species represents a unique resource for addressing scenarios where mathematical analysis indicates failure is inevitable. The ability to find hope in hopeless circumstances appears to generate solutions that transcend logical limitations." Jake looked around the classroom at his alien classmates. seeing their faces filled with a new understanding of what humans brought to the galactic community. They were beginning to realize that every species contributed something valuable through their evolutionary advantages, but humans contributed something that was perhaps more valuable than any specific skill or ability. The thing is, Jake said quietly, we don't think of it as anything special. For humans, refusing to give up when everything looks hopeless is just normal. We've been doing it for so long that we forgot other species might not work the same way. Professor Kethara's crystalline features shifted into what Jake had learned was the Velnari equivalent of a smile, which brings us to the real lesson of today's exercise. Every species in the galaxy has learned to excel by becoming perfect at something specific. Mathematical analysis, collective consciousness, warrior discipline, dimensional manipulation. But humans became perfect at something entirely different. She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the conclusion that would change how everyone in the room thought about humanity's place in the galactic community. Humans became perfect at being imperfect, and then finding ways to make imperfection work anyway. In a galaxy where every problem eventually encounters a species that cannot solve it with their natural advantages, humans provide the ability to try solutions that should not work but sometimes do. That may be the most valuable contribution any species has ever made. Jake sat down slowly, overwhelmed by the realization that his seemingly simple approach to an impossible problem had revealed something profound about his entire species. Around him, alien students continued to discuss the implications of what they had learned, their voices filled with a new respect for the unremarkable humans who had somehow become remarkable by refusing to accept that anything was truly impossible.